Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over Game 6 from the 2013 World Chess Championships. From the first 4 games, they were all draws. Game 5, Magnus Carlsen finally broke through with our first win of the tournament, and if you've been keeping up with it, every game so far has been more exciting than the last. So coming into Game 6, I didn't really know what to expect. We had Anand playing the white pieces, definitely looking for a win himself so he can get back to even in this game. Magnus Carlsen, in my opinion, can just kind of play for the draw, but it's getting to the point where, he has, in my opinion, more stamina. He's a little younger, and so he can kind of just grind down Anand and get himself in in-game situations where he feels comfortable, where he can either draw or actually play for the win if his opponent makes a dumb move. So we're going to go ahead and get into it. Anand starts with pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, and we see the Rye Lopez, this bishop coming out here to b5, and Magnus Carlsen defends the same way that he did just a few games ago with the Berlin defense. Now in that game, we actually saw the king castling, and then this knight comes down here and takes here on e4, and then we saw pawn here to d4. In this particular game, Anand decided to play a little bit different. From that game, Magnus Carlsen drew the game, but almost won, and so instead, Anand plays this pawn to d3, which he's had a lot of success with in the past, playing at high-level play, and so I think this fits Anand's style a little bit better. Magnus Carlsen responds with bishop here to c5 with the intent of he wants to get it outside this pawn chain. He can play his own pawn here to d6, kind of solidifying that pawn structure, but maintaining this control along this long diagonal right here. Same thing with Anand. He can always bring his bishop back to this long file, or this long diagonal, and kind of try to control this right now. But so we definitely have a much different Berlin defense than we had before. Now Anand decides to play pawn to c3. He had a lot of options here. He could have castled on the king side if he wanted to. He could have just immediately played his bishop coming out here. Could have played knight to c3. So definitely some options from him. Chose the interesting pawn here to c3. Later he can push forward with his pawn to d4. He may want to get his bishop out and then get his knight involved. Definitely an interesting move, though. Not one that I see too often in the Berlin defense, but my guess is Anand's been studying this for the past few months and definitely finds some lines that he thinks gives him the advantage. Magnus Carlsen now decides to go ahead and castle on the king side, and Anand does the same. Both sides just continue their development. The rook's going to swing over here, adding more protection on this pawn here on e5. The rook's going to come over e1, do the exact same thing. And then black's going to start to push this bishop away. This is going to be completely fine for both sides, I think. I think, white kind of enjoys bringing his bishop back here to b3. This is a very active square. And for Magnus Carlsen, again, he now has pushed a little bit on the queen side, but now he has this entire diagonal for his bishop here just to kind of rain down. So both sides have a lot of pressure, so it looks like we could definitely have some fireworks in this game as both sides could have a potential strong attack either way. Now, we haven't seen any pieces or pawns moved off the board, but we could in the near future. Now, the pawn's going to come to d6, is kind of what we talked about, solidifying this pawn chain, but he already has his dark square bishop out of the pawn chain, so it's definitely okay. And now this dark square bishop comes to g5. Definitely one of those strong moves. Again, there's no great square for it to come to. Something d2 is going to be too passive. E3 is a novel idea to try to, get this bishop off, which is very strong right now, off the board. But instead decides to go ahead and play this bishop here to g5, pinning down this knight here on f6. It would be one thing if this knight was on d7, it could protect it. But now, this queen's just awkwardly being pinned down by this knight. So Magnus Carlsen is going to have to find a way to kind of counterattack, this pin right here. And even, a pawn move to h6, the bishop's just going to come back here to h4, still applying that pressure on the board. We now see the bishop come to e6, kind of the same idea that we talked about if the bishop came to e3 is, white has this attack on this long diagonal right here, and typically for black this light square bishop is a little less of a nuisance, and so it's not doing as much. So if he can go ahead and trade this off, this is definitely going to be good for Magnus Carlsen. And now we see the knight come to d2. Again, really comes here just to get involved into the game because he can't come to c3, but it's really not doing too much here on d2, to be honest. So Anand's definitely going to want to make sure that he gets this more involved into the game, because right now it's doing nothing besides protecting this knight on f3, but it's not being attacked right now. Another option that we could have seen, the pawn come to d4, and then, the bishop could take right now. Again, Magnus Carlsen wants to get this light square bishop off the board. After we take here, there could be an exchange in the middle, and then after the bishop comes back, this knight can come to c3. There is doubled pawns here on the b file, but white has, a much more active position. He has, the 2 pawns here on the d and e file. He's controlling the center of the board. Again, Anand definitely looked at this and didn't think this was a great variation, but something that I think could have been pretty interesting for Anand, but he decided to just play the knight here to d2. Wasn't ready to give up any material in the game. So now we see pawn to h6, again just kind of pushing it back, but not really doing too much, just kind of a waiting move. And now the bishop's going to take here on b3. And so we see the recapture, and then this knight's going to come back here to b8. Again, if we look at what Magnus Carlsen wants to do, he wants to first make sure that this knight's not being pinned down. Again, it's just a huge pain with this bishop here on h4, and so he doesn't have any real strong attacks. The board's kind of cluttered right now, and so until he can get some of these pieces off the board, he's just going to rearrange his knight over here to d7 so that he can move his queen away and not have this knight being pinned down, because he doesn't want to recapture here and kind of leave his king exposed on the king side. So after the knight to b8, we now have the pawn push forward to h3, and then we see knight here to d7. Now from here, white has a few options. He could do b4, kind of push this bishop back. He wants to get his queen involved, so he could play c2. He could play e2 if he wanted to. He chose for the knight to h2, looking to get it more involved with knight here to g4. Again, you definitely don't want to keep it here on h2 for very long. Magnus Carlsen could start to apply some pressure. Now plays the queen to e7, looking to get involved into the game, more centralized of e6 since it's not being pinned down. And now we see knight to f1. Again, if Magnus Carlsen could apply pressure now, unfortunately for him, he really can't because there's no great squares or anything to do. But these knights on f1 and h2 aren't doing too much. But, again, this is kind of what you do. You maneuver your pieces. You don't try to force anything. You try to get them in better positions than they were before. And again, here on d2 and f3, they weren't doing too much. So now we're going to see the bishop come back here to b6. And then the knight's going to come here to f3. And Magnus Carlsen has the option to always just come down and take here. Now, right now, this rook's going to come and just take on e3, so there's no real reason to give up the Stark Square bishop right now, but just something to keep in mind later on. The queen's going to come to e6, and then this pawn finally pushes forward to b4. And then a6, trying to open up this a file, and so after the exchange, we see the bishop take right here. And then this knight's going to come to g4, trying to get more involved into the game. Obviously on h2 it's not doing too much. Now the bishop comes back and still wants to apply that pressure over here. And now we see the bishop take. And so the knight can recapture as we talked about. And after the knight takes, kind of interesting that Anand wants to go ahead and just give up, a lot of these minor pieces, especially as you're white. He wants, the option at least to go ahead and put a lot of pressure, but giving up more and more material in the game doesn't always lend to that. So now the queen's going to come here to g4, and this is interesting because black has now the opportunity to come in and just take with his bishop here on e3, whereas before he could try something, so he's kind of protecting this, because after the bishop takes here on e3, this pawn has to recapture. The rook can't recapture here on e3 because then the rook's just going to swing down here and take, and obviously black's going to be up in material. So definitely interesting choice for the queen to come to g4. It's not really doing too much right now, and so Magnus Carlsen immediately, although he wants to maintain this bishop, he recognizes that if he can go ahead and put these double pawns right here, if he can maybe attack this pawn here and have these isolated double pawns, this is definitely going to be good for him as they go into the end. So we look at what white could have done. Instead of bringing the queen here, he could have always first taken with his rook here on a8, and then after the recapture, now if he wanted to, he could bring his queen involved into the game. So if now the bishop took, he could just recapture with his rook. Again, in the game, that's not what happened. Instead, we see the queen come down, and now we have these pawns right here. Now the queen's going to come back here to e6, and then we have the rook swing over, trying to control the semi-open file. And then probably what I consider one of the best moves in the game, although it's small, Magnus Carlsen recognizes that there's these doubled pawns here on the e file, and he wants to try to chip away at this pawn right here on d3, so that, because right now this is not too bad. You have doubled pawns, but you have this protection, so depending on this could take right here, or this pawn could take, and then all of a sudden it's not too bad. But if this pawn can come off the board, this is really going to be super awkward for Anand to try to defend. And so after the king comes to h2, we see pawn push forward to c4, and this is exactly what Magnus Carlsen's trying to do. If there's a pawn take right here and then recapture, all of a sudden there's doubled pawns, and there's no way for white to really do anything except have an awkward pawn position. So definitely a great move from Magnus Carlsen, and Anand decides to push forward with pawn to d4. This would be great news right here if we could just take right here. Magnus Carlsen's not going to do that. Instead he plays, first takes his rook over here on a1, and then after the recapture, then the queen comes over and starts to attack, kind of chip away right here. So that, after the rook comes here to d1, the queen's going to get more involved. The queen comes up here, and now after the recapture, it's very interesting how we have to take. The pawn taking right here, where Anand would like to do, can no longer work, because now the queen can just come here to e4. Black's going to be up in material, and it is being protected by this rook. So white's almost forced to take with his rook here on d4. Also going to be a mistake if he takes with his pawn here, because again the queen can just come here. That's definitely going to be bad. So Magnus Carlsen almost forces Anand to have these doubled pawns here on e3 and e4. As you see from the rest of the game, Anand just has a really hard time of controlling the equality in the game, and Magnus Carlsen slowly chips away in the endgame, which is where he is the most dangerous. If you slip up in any way in the endgame, even if it's very, very minimal, he can just pounce on you, because again, this is where he's the best. So from here we see the rook come down to e5, getting more involved into the action, attacking the queen. The queen's going to move back, and we see some maneuvers, and we kind of go through, and both sides are just kind of feeling each other out. They also want to get to move 40. Right now we're on move 34, and so you get 2 hours for the first 40 moves, and then after that you get an additional hour for the next 20 moves. And so both sides, if you kind of look at it, they don't want to make any huge mistakes, but they're starting to run low on time, and so more than anything they just want to slowly improve their position, but then get into that 40 move mark, and then they have a fresh hour that they can kind of take a look at the game and see, okay, how am I going to go into the end game? So the king's going to swing over, and then a few moves later, if we kind of look at it, both sides aren't doing too much, to be honest, which is kind of expected. But as soon as we see this queen come back here a little bit, we see some exchanges right here as we get into the 40th move. And so after the 40th move, we now have a rook in game, but again, Magnus Carlsen has this slight lead. He is now up 1 pawn in material. Definitely something that he's comfortable with. We saw this in the last game where he was able to take this, find a small advantage, and then go on to win the game. So white's now going to attack the pawn over here on b5, and now the rook's going to swing over and defend this. And now black's just going to start to push. Again, pawns are meant to be pushed in the endgame, and so that's exactly what Magnus Carlsen does. And so as we kind of come through, Magnus Carlsen's just slowly pushing up his pieces, trying to maintain the tension. And so as we come through, Magnus Carlsen decides he wants to go ahead and just give up this pawn over here. He wants to swing his rook, starting to attack this king over here. He has the majority on the king side, and so that's where he wants to put the pressure. Over here on the queen side, Anand has the advantage, so he wants to start pushing on the queen side. So as far as what both sides want to do, that's it. Magnus Carlsen pushing on this side, Anand pushing on the queen side. Now see the king move down, and again the pressure just starting to push a little bit. This pawn h4 is very important because after the rook swings over, the king can come to h5, still protect both of these pawns, but you definitely don't want to get into a situation where your king has to move back here to f6, or even an awkward square of e or f4, and then this rook is kind of controlling it. You can't move past it. So now the rook's going to swing over here. Again, greater square for this rook right here. He can also now come to g4 and then g3 if he wanted to, starting to add some pressure. After the rook comes over here, that's exactly what Magnus Carlsen does, starting to force this king away. Now we see the king come over here to g5, protecting this pawn right here. Anand really has to, take this pawn on c4, and then he needs to start pushing up the board, or Magnus Carlsen's just going to keep pushing these pawns, and there's going to be nothing that Anand can do. So he checks the king, and then he comes back over here to c4. Magnus Carlsen seems to be okay with giving up this pawn, and so he does lose this pawn, and so both sides have 3 pawns. In this particular case, it's, as a lot of the GMs that were actually commentating on this game, this is theoretically a draw. Both sides have 3 pawns. Black's pushing on one side, white's pushing on the other. But theoretically, if both sides play correctly, this should be a draw, even though there's a lot of pawns on the board that can do stuff. After the pawn to f4, this is kind of where it fell apart for Anand. Magnus Carlsen's pushing on the king side, and if we look from the queen side, there's really only one thing that Anand should be thinking about, and that's counter pushing on the queen side. So he needs to be playing pawn to b4, and then again it's going to be a race, but it's going to be a draw in the end of it. Instead, he plays rook over here to a4, which just kind of loses time, and all you need is just a little bit of time in this game, and you can actually go ahead and win the game. So this pawn pushes to h3. There's really only one option, and that's to take with the pawn right here. But all this does, Magnus Carlsen is okay with giving up material. He wants to have this open door for this pawn to push forward with his pawn all the way down here. So now we see pawn to c4. Again, just too slow. He's definitely going to lose the race, and so we see f3, and now the rook coming to a3, but it doesn't matter. After the king to e2, Magnus Carlsen just pushing. There's really nothing stopping Magnus Carlsen right now. He can try to check all he wants to, but after the rook comes down here to g1, it's pretty much game over. Even if the rook comes over here to f8 check, e3, there's just no way to stop it. And so Anand looked at it and said, good game. And so we see in game 6, Magnus Carlsen has won and taken a massive advantage halfway through this tournament. We see 6 games left, and he has a 2-win advantage, which is going to be very, very difficult for Anand to come back from. I just don't see how Anand can win 2 of the next few games without Magnus Carlsen winning any of them. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this game. I definitely think we're going to have a new champion in a few weeks, which is kind of exciting. Such a young player, so gifted as Magnus Carlsen. So hopefully you enjoyed, and I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.